You might have heard it said in the past that America is a nation of immigrants. This is true, but you know what other countries are nations made out of immigrants? Canada, Mexico, Belize, Brazil, Australia, Nigeria, Poland, Japan, China, India, Germany, Ethiopia, and literally every single other nation on the planet. The definition of indigenous is entirely subjective since everyone's ancestors came from somewhere else at one point, and although it may have been 100 years ago, or 10,000 years ago, or it might have been from only a few miles away, or it might have been from across the very planet Earth, technically no one is native anywhere. For instance, someone in Britain may have a grandparent who is a Polish immigrant, but other than that, they would say, "Oh, I'm 100% British." Well, are you? It's very possible that they might have ancestry from the Norman conquest of England from the 11th century, and even if they didn't, it's pretty much guaranteed that they have ancestry from the Germanic conquest of Great Britain from the 5th century, and even the Irish and other Celts who also claim indigenous status in the British Isles also displaced a previous population thousands of years ago before that. And if you want to get really technical, Homo sapiens migrated from Africa and displaced the Neanderthal population of Europe, which might have in turn displaced another hominid group before them. Sometimes discussions like this can devolve into more of a philosophical exercise or just be completely pedantic. But that's not really what people mean when they use that term, nation of immigrants, now is it? What they really mean is that a certain group of people during a certain time immigrated to a certain area of the world. So, okay, how are we going to define this? Every region has had its own periods of mass migration and ethnic, religious, genetic, and linguistic paradigm shifts and upheavals. But for today's video, we'll be defining indigenous as those who were present in a region before the European Age of Discovery, starting in the late 15th century AD. Before this, you still had major ethnographic changes in world history, such as the Turco-Mongol invasion and settlement in Central Asia, the Austronesian migration into Southeast Asia, or the Indo-Aryan invasions into South Asia. But this era marked a major period of mass human movement unparalleled in known history. If you are currently living in an area of the planet where your ancestors were not located 500 years ago, you are a part of something very special, very unique in human history. The vast majority of the current population of mankind has not moved significantly in the past 5 centuries, but I personally estimate that around 16% of the Earth's population lives in a region of the planet that their ancestors were not native to around the year 1500, making them an unequivocal global minority. Whether your ancestors came to the US 200 years ago on a boat from Europe, or maybe they were forcibly brought to the country from Africa, or maybe you yourself are an immigrant from a faraway land such as India or the Philippines, and you chose to take the plunge and move halfway across the world to America. It certainly takes a lot of bravery and perseverance to adapt and survive in a land and environment that is completely alien to you and your ancestors. But what about the immigrant nations that don't really get too much focus in the modern day? We all know about America's sibling nations, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, all former British colonies who were initially settled by a wave of Europeans from various parts of the continent before opening up to immigration from other parts of the world as well, and their indigenous inhabitants still are around to varying extents. But there are others, of course. We'll mainly be focusing on areas outside of the Americas for this video, since I think I've already discussed the patterns of immigration to North and South America in depth in previous videos. So instead, let's look at some of the immigrant nations of Africa first. Well, if they can even be considered a part of the African continent, which is debatable. Cape Verde, or Cabo Verde, is a collection of small islands off the coast of West Africa that were completely uninhabited upon their discovery by the Portuguese in the 15th century. So according to our parameters we set earlier in this video, by definition, 100% of anyone who settled on these islands or their descendants can be described as immigrants or descendants of immigrants. Although they never really received a wave of mass migration, there were a few Portuguese who settled on the island and brought slaves with them from neighboring Senegal. Intermixing with said slaves produced a mixed race class that would gradually grow and intermix with other Europeans, giving birth to the first people who could be considered native to Cape Verde, an Afro-Portuguese Creole group numbering over 500,000 with a substantial diaspora in other parts of the world today. Are they considered indigenous to the islands? or are they still seen as immigrants? I suppose it's a subjective issue and relative to the dates you're looking at. Sao Tome and Principe, further south along the African coast, has a similar history, although their inhabitants have less European and West African admixture and more ancestry from the neighboring Congo and Angola, although they were also uninhabited upon discovery. Another set of islands in the Atlantic, Ascension, St. Helena, and Tristan da Cunha, were also completely uninhabited upon their discovery by the Portuguese and eventual annexation by the British. The people who live there today have extremely diverse origins, descending from European migrants, liberated African slaves, as well as Chinese and Indian workers. Being located in the middle of the South Atlantic between Africa, South America, and Antarctica, it's rather strange to think of anyone as native to these islands, though, due to their isolation. You might as well be talking about people being native on the surface of the moon. I talk about this area a lot because it's truly fascinating to me, but the Mascarene Islands off the coast of East Africa in the Indian Ocean also have a similar history of being uninhabited upon annexation by European powers, with their populations being a mix of Indian, African, Malagasy, European, and Chinese peoples. It can therefore be said that all of these countries and territories are literally 100% descended from immigrants after the year 1500. But it's not only remote islands where this is true. Europeans were not the only ones to participate in colonialism and mass migration, not even in the past 500 years. Although most of North Africa was conquered by the Arabs pretty early on after the spread of Islam, Sudan, or as it was known in the past, Nubia, actually remained pretty stubborn against the Islamic expansion for centuries. Nubia, which had two Christian kingdoms known as Makuria and Alodia, similar to Ethiopia, actually didn't fall to the Islamic invasions until the 15th century, when a combined Arab and Beja force finally broke through and destroyed the remnants of these kingdoms, rapidly converting the population to Islam and spreading a unique Arab culture throughout Sudan. The majority of Arab migrants intermarried with the Nubians, although a few full-blooded Arab tribes do exist, and today around 60 to 70% of Sudan's population would describe themselves as ethnically Arab. So it's safe to say that Sudan has been an Arab country for about as long as Mexico has been a Hispanic country. You might have heard of a little country called Singapore, the Lion City. Before 1500, Singapore was a part of many historic empires of Southeast Asia, but its population never exactly boomed. By its annexation by the British in 1819, less than 1,000 people lived in villages across the island, but by turning it into the capital of the British Strait settlement, tens of thousands of people from the surrounding area flooded onto the island. Ethnic Malays would have been considered the indigenous people in 1500, but the percentage of Malays on the island today that are actually descended from the original Singaporean Malaysians is probably extremely small, as most ethnic Malays in Singapore today came from other parts of Malaysia or Indonesia. Similarly, most of the ethnic Chinese in Singapore came from other parts of Southeast Asia or from China proper. And with a population of nearly 6 million people today, it's safe to say the overwhelming majority of Singapore's current population are descended from these immigrants. When I was in Singapore, I even heard many in the country themselves tell me that Singapore was the melting pot of Asia, similar to the USA, which I suppose is pretty much true considering 99% of the country's population is descended from immigrants from after 1830. Neighboring Malaysia also had a huge immigrant population and an even larger number with some immigrant background. Although around 2/3 of the country identify as Bumiputera, a racial term indicating Austronesian or Orang Asli origin, a large percentage are actually descended from Indonesian immigrants from during and after the colonial period. 10 to 30% of ethnic Malays today have some roots in neighboring Indonesia, and an indeterminable amount also have ancestry from the Middle East from when Arab and Persian traders spread Islam to the region. Going back further than that, many also have ancestry from ancient India when the region was Hindu, although over the years these more ancient Indian migrants assimilated into Malay society, with most of the country's South Asian population of 3 million being more recent immigrants from the colonial age. What about Europe? Well, for many smaller states such as Andorra, Monaco, and Luxembourg, a very large portion of their populations are descended from other European immigrants, with 52, 70, and 49% of their countries being made up of foreign nationals, respectively. But the largest hub of migration in Europe historically would probably be France, as millions of French, possibly as high as 10% of the population, are descended from southern Europeans from Italy, Spain, and Portugal, and many more from Eastern Europe, as well as in addition to more recent non European migrants, mainly from North Africa. The nearby Channel Islands belonging to Britain also have immigrant populations of over 50%, mainly from the mainland of Great Britain, but also from Portugal and Poland, who provide some of the largest ethnic minorities throughout Western Europe. And then, of course, we have the states of the Arab or Persian Gulf, as only 10 to 40% of the current populations of countries like the UAE or Kuwait are actually native born, with citizenship being near impossible to attain for most migrant workers. So, this is a really interesting case where, although the vast majority of the population are made up of immigrants, they would probably not identify themselves as a nation of immigrants, since migrants aren't exactly seen as permanent residents in those countries and have very little to no political influence. Flip side to that, in Oceania, there are a couple U.S. territories that are also majority immigrant descended, such as Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands, where the indigenous Chamorro people only make up 37 and 24% of the populations, respectively. Unfortunately, I'm running out of time, so I can't get to the nuances of all these locales and their history of migrations, assimilations, and intermixing, but here's a map of what I think it would look like if I had to estimate what percentage of each country's population are currently descended from immigrants within the past 500 years. Although I need to add like a million caveats, since most of these countries didn't even exist 500 years ago, and tracking migration between said areas would be nearly impossible. This is just my best educated guess. So, to cap it off, who exactly is an immigrant? Well, you are. Or maybe not you specifically, but your ancestors certainly were. Although most of the human population today is located in the same area their ancestors were from 500 years ago, if you go back far enough, all of them came from somewhere else, either gradually or suddenly, near or far. We're all immigrants, and it's only a matter of time before the Neanderthals get their revenge. So thank you all so much for watching. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.